Next up, we are going to be discussing the health effects of sugars. Now, it's no secret that overconsuming sugary foods can potentially have negative health consequences. So, if you were to be speaking to a future patient, for example, the first piece of advice that you would extend would hopefully be just enjoy them in moderation. And the reason is that certain dietary sugars can increase the risk for certain chronic disease. A lot of fingers have been pointing at high fructose corn syrup as the culprit. Now, high fructose corn syrup is essentially cheap sugar, and they add it to many processed foods. And some of the research suggests that after it's metabolized, primarily in the liver, it bypasses glycolysis step, which is the breakdown of glucose, and ultimately favors lipogenesis, which is the creation of adipose tissue. In addition, several studies have found changes in circulating lipids when subjects eat high fructose corn syrup diets, and also increasing their risk for chronic disease. Another concern with heavy intake of added sugars is that they may displace needed nutrients and fiber. Instead, one would only be taking in calories without the added benefit of needed nutrients, basically being empty calories. Instead, treat these types of foods as discretionary calories only. Now, depending on what sources you read, some people believe that honey is good for you because it comes from a natural source. Well, that's partially true. If you visit the National Honey Board's website, which is simply enough www.honey.com, there has been a lot of research in this area for its benefits and anti-inflammatory properties. But in the meantime, we're just going to stick to the basics here. The chemical structure is similar to sucrose in that it contains a molecule of glucose and fructose. Now, one of the interesting things is honey is more of a supersaturated solution, and this is made up of sugars and water. And if you didn't already know, it's made by bees that come from the nectar of flowers. So basically, it's a mixture of fructose, glucose, and some sucrose. Gram for gram, honey is sweeter tasting, and this is because of its high fructose content. Per teaspoon, honey has more calories than table sugar too, which is, I believe, 20 versus the 16 kcals per teaspoon that's in regular sugar. Because honey, remember, is a solution of sugars, where table sugar is just granules. And so you have the actual fructose and glucose hooked together, but you also have some circulating free monosaccharides that are also present. And since honey is collected from plants, it contains very small amounts of substances called antioxidants, and this is where a lot of the research attention has also been coming from. And antioxidants are also known to have lots of health benefits, namely anti-inflammatory properties. And again, this is where all the research has been pointing. The question is if consumers can eat enough of it to actually see these benefits, in contrast to the amount of sugar that they're actually taking in. One thing is important to note, that you cannot give honey to infants because wild honey is a potential source of the C. botulinum spore. Now, we now know that both sugars and starches begin breaking down in the mouth via amylase. So sugars can contribute to tooth decay. The bacteria in the mouth ferment the sugars and produce an acid, and this acid can start dissolving the tooth enamel. However, it doesn't have to happen. The key is how long is that sugar in the mouth, or is there a constant flow of sugar intake all day? In addition, foods that are sticky can also leave havoc because they kind of wedge themselves either between or they just hang out for a long time on the teeth. I was once told by a dentist that the candy, if some of you have ever heard of it, they're called lemon heads. And maybe it's dating me and I don't even know if they still sell them. But lemon heads are probably the worst because not only are they sticky and they're full of sugar, but they also have the citric acid for that lemon flavoring. And it is the end all of horrible candy to eat. So, it's best to eat sugary foods with meals than in between meals. Foods like milk and cheese are helpful in protecting because the bacteria, because they help neutralize that acidity. And finally, just simply practicing good oral hygiene will prevent tooth decay rather than just eliminating sugar altogether. So for the dietary guidelines, the overall accepted notion is just reduce the intake of total calories from added sugar. Keep them minimum and discretionary. The DRI, in terms of added sugar, try to keep them no more than 25% of the day's total energy. Because if so, it could have a negative impact on other food groups, basically displacing other foods that you should be eating instead. The World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization suggest limiting consumption of added sugars to less than 10% of total energy. There has been a ton of research linking diet in whole grains that is high in whole grains to a lower risk for heart disease. It is specifically protecting against things like heart attacks and strokes by helping to lower cholesterol, as we talked about in part 1 of this lecture, and helping lower blood pressure as well as reduce overall vascular inflammation. These types of diets include whole grains and soluble fibers such as oat bran, barley, and legumes. Some research has suggested that diets that have plenty of fiber has this effect by displacing bad fats in the diet. In addition, there are also many phytochemicals that naturally occur in these rich fiber foods, which have been associated with reducing inflammation and decreasing heart disease risk. High fiber and whole grains have a very important role in the diet for those managing their diabetes. In particular to soluble fiber and its viscosity, as it slows the passage of food, it can also reduce the absorption, or at least slow the absorption, be better said, of glucose. This is an important part to prevent a massive surge and then negative rebound in blood glucose. I went into quite a bit of detail on how fiber can benefit the health of the large intestine in part 1. That is, how it can strengthen its walls by pushing the walls back and forth. One thing that I didn't note is that it's also important to be drinking plenty of fluids in order for the water to be drawn and increase the bulk of the stool. In addition to adding strength, fiber also helps the appearance of outpouches due to weakened walls known as diverticulitis. We noted weight management earlier and how high fiber and whole grains provide the feeling of fullness and satiety. This would be very useful information for those individuals seeking advice on shedding excess weight. The mountains of research in this area, that is, of cancer and fiber intake, have suggested an inverse relationship between the two. That is, the inverse relationship between dietary fiber intake and colon cancer. Now, a reason could be that this could be the strengthening of the walls of the GI tract, but fiber also acts like a scrub brush, and it's said to help reduce the incidence of colon cancer by diluting and then binding and rapidly removing potential cancer-causing agents from the colon. It is followed by the stimulating bacterial fermentation, which in turn releases these acids that make it a very unhappy place for cancer cells to live. Isn't fiber great? Now note that these studies were only confirming the intake of dietary fiber and not the type that come from supplements, which supports the reasoning that whole foods are better than just surviving off supplements rather than aiming for a balanced diet. And again, I always say the note that there is a place for supplements, but if it's possible, always go for the whole foods first. Okay, I say fiber is great. It is great, but not too much of it, not excessive amounts of it. So before you go run out and start filling your cupboards with high fiber foods, it's important to note that there's a limit to what is a healthy amount. Remember that fiber doesn't contain energy that we as human beings without a foregut can break down. Therefore, you would essentially be displacing actual calories that you do need, in addition to all of the other important nutrients that go along with them. If you do not slowly incorporate these higher fiber foods in your diet, the outcome could be abdominal discomfort, gas, diarrhea, Worst case, you could actually cause an obstruction, and that would be a very serious situation. I mentioned in part 1 that fiber has the ability to bind certain minerals. However, with a reasonable intake of fiber, one does not compromise their mineral balance. So, keeping with the theme of this course, keep it in balance, moderation, and of course, variety of fiber. Now, the DRI for carbohydrates, you keep them between 45 to 65% of your energy requirement. The RDA for carbohydrates is roughly 130 grams per day. The daily value per 1,000 calories is 11.5 grams per 1,000 calories. And the DRI, or the daily value, the DRI is 14 grams per 1,000 calories. So it's roughly, you could say, some people go around 25 grams, but 25 to 30 grams, depending on how you structure your diet. Of course, this is an average. I could tell you that most people in the US at least eat about half of that a day. So there is no upper limit, but you certainly don't want to go over 40 grams for the reasons that we talked about a second ago. So what kind of recommendations would you give to a future client, a future patient, was that they should be reading their food labels. And so you want to look at the total carbohydrates, look at the starch, how much fiber, and the types of fiber if they actually put the type of fiber on there. And compare that to the amount of sugar in the actual food product that they're eating. And again, just sugar, they have added sugars, which a lot do, such as high fructose corn syrup, and about natural sugars. And there are natural sugars, and that's fine, but it's something that you also want to pay attention to in terms of just overall caloric intake. So this is 3 sort of generic food labels, but they all tend to look the same when you compare all these different types of breads. So you have whole grain, and we know what whole grain means, and natural and wheat bread, and of course the multi-fiber or low-carb bread. And I'm convinced that low-carb bread is just physically smaller, and that's why it's less calories, but that could just be me. I don't hang out in bread aisles all day, but I am curious when I see them. One of the things that you should look at when you compare these labels is that it says whole grain. That's the key. Because if you look at the next one, which is wheat bread is white bread. That happens to be brown, right? That's the way I look at it. So the idea is whole wheat versus wheat. You can look at some of the multi-fiber breads and just do a comparison. Look at the amount of fiber that's in each of them. You can look at some of the protein, but remember what we talked about in terms of protein, that these probably aren't complete proteins. Also, you could see at the bottom of the multi-fiber, there's sucralose, so there's an added sugar, artificial sugar. So these are things to think about when you're considering what types of foods to buy. And the simplest test that I like to do is that and maybe some of you have learned this when you took your nutrition classes, for those who have taken nutrition classes, that next time you're in the bread aisle, just grab 2 loaves, and you can start with white bread. I don't know if you guys still have Wonder Bread on the shelves. I think, I'm not sure if they're going out of business, but hold white bread and then grab in your other hand whole grain bread. Feel the weight difference. You will be able to feel it. And then compare the heavier the bread, just consider that just the closer to sticks you're getting in terms of fiber content. And you just have to find the one that is right for you, and one that tastes good for you. So these are the types of things I want you to think about in terms of carbohydrates, and things that you as a future healthcare professional, in whatever field you end up going, is something that I hope you pass on to your future patients.